Hi, so I'm Brandon Fess. I am the Special Collections Librarian here at the Rochester Public Library's Local History and Genealogy Division. I'm responsible for all of our manuscript collections and rare materials. I'm also a specialist in the history of 19th century America with a particular interest in the Civil War and its aftermath. Rochester produced cavalrymen, infantrymen, light artillery, heavy artillery, sailors in the Navy, and every one of them would have had a different experience. Just to give a little more broad perspective, you would have had everything from the men who were recruited into, say, the 1st and 8th New York Cavalry, which included companies from this area, who would have seen, the glamour of being horsemen in combat and very often relatively light action, to line infantry units. Rochester produced many infantry. Infantry are the backbone of any army. 108th, 126th, 140th, 188th, many others, all had their own rough moments. You would have had anything from the 126th being taken captive en masse by Stonewall Jackson, some of the Harper's Ferry cowards of September 1862, to them, being paroled, being mocked by their peers, and then getting revenge through their actions at Gettysburg as well. Very different experience for the artillery units. I know very little about the light artillery, unfortunately. Heavy artillery, in contrast, heavy artillery was considered the easiest job in the Army. You're sent to man fixed fortifications. Unless somebody attacks the fort that you're based at, you don't see action. Except for those men who Grant turned into infantry in 1864 because he realized the garrison of D.C. was way larger than it needed to be. And a lot of the men of the 8th New York Heavy Artillery were from Rochester. Heavy artillery units were twice the size of infantry units, by the way, so they were very tempting to turn into active combat units. And so Grant turned these fully manned, veteran but not experienced in battle units into infantry, and the 8th New York was one of the ones that was thrown into action during the Overland Campaign. I know they were used in some of the assaults at Spotsylvania Courthouse. That would have been terrifying. Not just the direct action of combat, but the whole, I didn't sign up for this element of being a heavy artilleryman. And of course there were the sailors. Not all sailors were people who had sailed before the war, and we do have stories of Rochesterians who joined the Navy. Naval service is its own form of difficulty. You're in a ship on open water in an age before there were really any creature comforts on shipboard. It's cold, it's wet, the food is bad most of the time, and frankly, most of the time you're at sea, you are out there just waiting and watching for, is the enemy here? Are we going to encounter anyone? Or are we going to be out at sea for 30 days, 60 days, and have nothing happen? So there's a variety of experiences. It's really difficult to generalize, but the biggest thing I can say is that all of them would have dealt with privation and surprise in ways that, even for men who joined up later in the war and had heard stories coming back from the front, would not really have been prepared for.
There were many reasons, and very diverse reasons. There were treaties that provided alliance between the United States and Native people. The Tonawanda Senecas, for example, signed a treaty in 1857, a new treaty that allowed them to repurchase their land, and so Tonawanda Senecas felt an obligation to serve in the military. But economically, there was a significant amount of encouragement based on the fact that you're dealing with rather very poor communities financially, economically. And so economically, this was definitely an incentive, as it is today, to enlist. There were also, of course, ideas about tradition. Native Americans served in the War of 1812 in the Union Army, in the U.S. Army, and so the grandchildren and the children of those soldiers participated in the Civil War. It was a military tradition in certain families, so that was part of it. In other parts of the country, there were other reasons. For example, some Native Americans owned slaves. And in the Indian Territory, for example, that is now the state of Oklahoma, for example, there were Cherokees and others who were slaveholders and fought on the side of the Confederacy. There were also, of course, Native Americans of African American descent, which is not usually known, but there was a large number of Native Americans, especially in New England and in southern areas, that joined the Union Army because of their identification with the idea of freedom for both black people and better days for Native Americans.
Reasons. I mean, people in Rochester fought for the same reasons that people fought across the country. Perhaps the percentages of those reasons were different, because yes, there were people who were joining up for the bounties, which could be hundreds of dollars. That's tens of thousands today. Land grants in the West, things like that. But based on research, there's been a lot of research on this topic in the past couple of decades trying to really definitively nail down why did men fight. The driving reason was a belief that slavery was either, if you were a Southerner, something to be supported, or a Northerner, something that was an American ill. Now, the ways in which people thought about that varied a lot. You notice I talk about anti-slavery and abolition. Those were two different things in the language of the time. Far more people were anti-slavery, people who wanted to see slavery brought to an end, than were abolition, people who thought it needed to come to an end immediately. Abolition was oftentimes tied to beliefs in, for example, equal rights. A lot of anti-slavery folks would have been just as happy to see all people of African descent sent back to Africa. Their goal was to end slavery. It's a very difficult and very nuanced conversation. But what I can tell you is that the Rochester area undoubtedly had a very high proportion of people who were at the least anti-slavery, if not abolition supporters. And there would have been a lot of people who joined the military because of those views. That, of course, being on top of, and from the best evidence that's been collected by scholars like Chandra Manning, in front of also beliefs in the indissolubility of the Union and the need to restore the Union as the rightful government and maintain the Constitution as the law of an undivided United States.